Hello, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. Hope everyone is staying safe and staying healthy in this yet another week away from one another. Just again, praying for you all. Hope everybody's doing well during this time. Today, we're going to continue on with our study of David as we have been doing the last few weeks. Last week, we just kind of looked at a few of the Psalms that David wrote during the time times that he had some difficulties, times that he was in his low spots, and what did David write, and how did David feel during those difficult times. We looked at those, and as we are now living in a difficult time and a time where things are tough for a lot of people, I think that kind of translated to how things are going for us right now. And as we are living in these difficult, uncertain times, we can take some of the things that David wrote during his low points and apply those things to our lives. And we can remember that we need to rely on God. He is our shepherd. He is going to take care of us. He's going to lead us to where we need to go, but we need to trust him and follow him and allow God to be our shepherd. We also need to remember that God is always there. No matter what, no matter how low we might feel, no matter how bad things might get, God is always going to be there. He's not going anywhere. And we don't have anything to fear because we do have God. Things might seem scary, things might seem way beyond our control, but we don't have to worry about that. We don't have to fear anything because we have God and his love and the hope that we have through his love, that we don't live for anything on this earth. We live to be with God in heaven, and nothing on this earth can take us away from that. And so as we looked through those Psalms, we looked at those different things and how we can learn from David on how to make it through some tough times by using our faith in God to do that. Now, a couple of weeks ago, we had kind of stopped on our narrative of the story of David to take a break to look at some of the Psalms, but where we left off in the story of David was the death of Saul. David was living among the Philistines, hiding from Saul. He had been there for over a year, almost a year and a half, just trying to get away from Saul. He had gone through some difficult times, kind of moved away from God during this time. His faith had been shaken. He wasn't sure that he was going to make it. He thought Saul was going to kill him, and so he kind of lost some of that faith that he had in God and moved in with the Philistines and had some rough times there. But in the end, where we left off, Saul had died in battle, in the battle of the Philistines, and he fell on his own sword and died in battle. And so that's where we left off with the story, with Saul and his son Jonathan both dying in that battle. So we move into 2 Samuel, the book of 2 Samuel, if you're wanting to follow along. We're going to be in the first few chapters of 2 Samuel. We see that in 2 Samuel chapter 1. It starts off with David hearing about the death of Saul. We're going to kind of continue along with the way that we had been doing things. Maybe follow along in the Bible and we'll talk about it, but I'm not going to read everything word for word. That would be a long story, but I'll just kind of paraphrase the story as we go here. But 2 Samuel chapter 1 starts with David hearing about the death of Saul and the death of his friend Jonathan. And he hears this from a man who comes into his camp, an Amalekite, who brings the crown and armband of Saul to David. And of course David asks, well, how did you get this? And he tells the story of Saul dying in battle, and he kind of changes the narrative from what we read at the end of 1 Samuel. At the end of 1 Samuel, we see that the Philistines are closing in on Saul, and so he decides to fall on his own sword, and then he dies there that way. This Amalekite says that Saul was asking him to kill him before the Philistines got there, and that's what he did. He said, no, I was the one that struck down Saul, and here I brought this to you, the crown and the armband to you, David. But he changed up this story because, as we see it in 1 Samuel, Saul didn't do that. Saul asked his armor bearer, but then he fell on his own sword. And so what we have here is this man lying to David, saying that he killed Saul, and I'm bringing the crown to you now, David. Of course, David didn't like that. I mean, David had his own chances, as we've seen before, to kill Saul, but he didn't, because Saul was God's anointed king over God's people. And so David never did that because he saw that as a sin against God. And so when this man comes up and says, "Hey David, look, I killed this king. Here's the crown for you," David didn't react the way that this Amalekite man thought he might. I think this Amalekite guy thought that maybe he would get a reward or something. "Hey, I killed the king that's been trying to kill you. Maybe you can do something for me too, get a reward out of it." But David's had the opposite reaction. He said, "Oh, you said that you killed him. Well, the same thing is going to happen to you now." And so David's reaction was not one that you would expect from someone whose enemy had just died. This man that had been fleeing Saul for almost half of his life at this point, didn't take joy in this, didn't take celebration, didn't make a big celebration of the fact that Saul was dead. He could quit running. David mourned Saul's death. He took it hard. He wept for Saul, and he wept for his friend Jonathan. We see this in 1 Samuel 1 verses 19 and also 21 and 23. When David says this about Saul's death: "Your glory, O Israel, lies slain on your heights. How the mighty have fallen." And then verse 21, "Mountains of Gilboa, may you have neither dew nor rain, may no showers fall on your terraced fields. For there the shield of the mighty was despised, the shield of Saul, no longer rubbed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the flesh of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back, the sword of Saul did not return unsatisfied. Saul and Jonathan, in life they were loved and admired, and in death they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions." And it seems kind of like a strange thing to say for when your enemy has just been slain and you can go home and you can now get the throne that you had been promised. Instead of celebrating and being happy about it, David was sad. He was mourning this fact, and he talks about it here. He talks about how Israel's glory was slain when talking about Saul, which doesn't seem like something you'd say about your enemy. And then he cursed the ground where Saul had died and said, no more rain is going to fall there. And then he references Saul along with his son Jonathan as mighty lions, stronger than lions, and swifter than eagles. He builds them up, even though Saul was his enemy. But David didn't see Saul as his enemy, but he saw him as God's anointed king. That's the way David saw Saul. I think one of the things that we can learn from David is that we need to not look at others as enemies and look at others as people that are just looking to get us or things like that. People who maybe are active in trying to harm us, but sometimes we see people as enemies that just think differently than us and have different values than us. But one of the things I think we can learn from David is to say, I'm not going to look at this person as an enemy, but I'm going to look at this person as a child of God. I'm going to look at these people as children of God. And I think David probably had a better reason than any of us to have Saul as an enemy. Saul chased him around, tried to kill him for a very long time. But David chose to see Saul as a child of God, as God's anointed king. And I think that's the way that we need to look at others, that they're not our enemies, they are the children of God. So then after Saul is dead, obviously there's a power vacuum in Israel. There's no one to take over right away. And so we see now there's going to be a little bit of a battle for power in Israel. So the first thing that David does is ask God what he needs to do. So after David had been, again, kind of turned his back on God for a while in the land of the Philistines, he had turned back to God, and he's back to asking God what he needs to do first. So the first thing that he does is he talks to God. So, God, what do I need to do? And God says, hey, you need to go to Hebron, that's where you need to go, and you'll be anointed king. And so that's where David goes, and he is anointed king over Judah. We see this in 2 Samuel 2, verses 1 through 4. In the course of time, David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go up to one of the towns of Judah?" he asked. The Lord said, "Go up." David asked, "Where shall I go?" "To Hebron," the Lord answered. So David went up there with his 2 wives. And David also took the men who were with him, each with his family, and they settled in Hebron and its towns. Then the men of Judah came to Hebron, and there they anointed David king over the tribe of Judah. And so David was anointed king, but only over the tribe of Judah. There was still a lot more Israel out there to go. And we see at the same time as this was going on, one of Saul's sons, named Ishbosheth, was being set up as king over some of the other tribes. And the person behind this was Abner, or Saul's commanding officer. And then some of the Philistines ruled over some of the other tribes of Israel. And so while David is being anointed king over Judah, one of Saul's sons is being anointed king over the other part of Israel. And so this is obviously a big problem, because now you have 2 people that are claiming to be king over parts of Israel. And so civil war breaks out between David and Ishbosheth, and they're going to fight for power over Israel. Now, in this part of the story, there are a lot of things that happen. I don't want to get into too much detail about them. It's not what I want to talk about this morning, but we do need to go over the story, I think, a little bit here. But a lot of things happen during this time, and some higher-ups on both sides get killed during this war for power. And one of the people that does get killed is Abner, which is Ishbosheth's commander. And when this happens, it kind of takes the wind out of the sails of Ishbosheth. He kind of goes into a depression, and he loses heart in this whole battle. I think Abner was probably the one that was pushing a lot of it, and when Abner dies, Ishbosheth kind of loses his zeal for going and attacking David. And when he does this, it kind of makes the rest of the people in the area question his leadership and think, well, if he's not going to be in this, what are we going to do about it? And so a couple of people in Ishbosheth's part of the kingdom decided that they were going to take it on themselves to get rid of Ishbosheth. And so they went when he was sleeping in his bed, and they killed him, and they took his head and presented it to David, again looking for a reward. They thought maybe David would be happy that they took out his enemy, that he wouldn't have to worry about Ishbosheth anymore. And so they went to David and said, "Hey, look what we did for you." And David said, "You didn't hear about the Amalekite guy that had told me about Saul, did you?" Because basically that's what happened to them as well. They both were killed for that, for, as David said, murdering a man in his own bed. And so David now, though, is made king over all of Israel. With Ishbosheth gone, there's no longer an enemy, and so David is then made king over all of Israel. 2 Samuel 5, 1-3 says, "All the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, 'We are your own flesh and blood. In the past, while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. And the Lord said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler.' When all the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron, the king made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel." So now David was king over all of Israel. After all these years, after all these struggles, the promise that God made to him finally came true. So the first thing that David does is go and take over Jerusalem, who had been overrun by the Jebusites at that time. And so David takes over Jerusalem and sets it up as the capital and sets it up as the city of God. And then he goes and takes the rest of the territory back from the Philistines that had been taken. And so David finally becomes the king that he was promised. I think the big thing that I want to really look at, and the point I want to really focus on this morning is verses 4 and 5 of 2 Samuel chapter 5. And this is where we learn of David's patience. In 2 Samuel 5, verses 4 and 5, David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 40 years. In Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months. And in Jerusalem, he reigned over all Israel and Judah for 33 years. That's a long time to be patient. I mean, he was 30 years old when he finally gets anointed ruler of Judah, and then it took another 7.5 years before he was the ruler of all Israel. So if we go back kind of our timeline that we had talked about before, when David fought Goliath, he was probably 12, 13 years old. And then it was probably a few years after that Saul started chasing him around. So I mean, again, I think I'm not the best at math, but we're looking at least 10 years or so of David running from Saul during this time, and living outside and in caves and running from Saul was probably around 10 years worth of running. And so you think of David, who was anointed king, and he was running around for a decade just trying not to get killed. And so then Saul dies, and David has a chance to become king over all of Israel, but instead he is just the king over Judah. And he's king over just Judah for 7.5 years. That's a pretty long time. To think, you think about, well, you know, hey God, you promised me that this was going to happen. This is what you told me was going to happen. Why am I waiting around? It really didn't seem like Ishbosheth was that strong of a leader. He probably could have been taken over pretty easily by David, but David was patient. David was patient. David was waiting on God's time and not his own. I think that's one of the hard things that we face in our lives, is working on God's time and not working on our own. I think patience is such a hard thing for us, especially when it comes to waiting on God, right? God is God, and right, he's omnipotent, and he has all the powers in this universe. He can make anything happen, but we want it to happen on our time and not his. You know, we ask God for something, and if it's not there by the next day, you know, whatever, we're kind of like, hey God, where are you at? You know, why can't you do what I asked, or, you know, or answer me, you know, all these other things that we tend to do. And it's usually because we're waiting on our time. We live such impatient lives now. We want things to be instant. Now you just think about, especially right now, you order a package, it's about the only way you can get some things now. You order a package and you have the option for next day delivery or 2-day delivery. But if it starts to take more than that, we think, man, that's just too long. You know, if I have to wait more than 2 days for my package to be delivered, you know, I'll go ahead and pay the extra to get the premium service so I can get it the next day. I mean, we want things now. You think about workouts. You know, I want to get in shape. Well, I went jogging yesterday. How come I'm not in great shape now? You know, I lifted some weights. I should be buff the next day. That's not how it works. Even with this virus, right? So many videos and so many posts about people being, you know, going crazy in their homes, and it's been a week or two, and you know, we're losing our patience. We want to go outside. We want to do things. It's a lot, mostly because we're pretty impatient people. I think one of the ways that we can really show our faith in God is to have patience. Be patient, like David was patient. There are a lot of stories in the Bible about people who had great faith, and I think as we read those stories, we kind of gloss over, or read quickly over the word years that show up in those stories. As we read it, you know, it's just one chapter after another page. You know, we can read the story of Abraham or Moses or David. If we sit down and read it, we could read it pretty quickly. And so it seems like all these things just happen real quickly for these people, but if you really focus on the words, we see that a lot of these things happen over long periods of time and after many years. And you think of Abraham. Abraham was 100 years old when he had Isaac. That's a long time to wait. I think about the story of Noah. It took him a long time, decades, to build the ark. You imagine building a boat or a box for decades and still wondering, man, is this really going to happen? And then even after the flood came, he was on the ark for over a year. And that's a lot of patience. And that takes faith to know that God is going to do what he said. And trusting that and saying, you know what, I'm going to trust God's time and I'm not going to worry about my time. So I think a lot of times when we talk about our faith, I think patience goes hand in hand with that. If we want to say that we trust God and that we know that God is going to work in our lives, we have to be okay with waiting for that sometimes. We have to be okay with saying, God, I'm going to work on your time and not on my time. There's the verse in 2 Peter 3 that talks about 1,000 years is like a day and a day is like 1,000 years to God. And sometimes it feels like 1,000 years after God has said something, it finally happens. Well, that's God working on God's time. And Jesus said, I'm coming back soon. Well, it's been 2,000 years, and it's kind of makes you think, well, what does soon actually mean, right? And that's when we think about our time. What does it mean for us? What does soon mean for us? Well, it means something different to God a lot of times. God is going to work on his time because he knows what we need when we need it. And so when we're living, when we're putting our faith in God, we need to remember that patience is a big part of that. I need to be patient with God and allow God to work because he knows what's best for me and knows what time is best for me. And I think patience is something that we need a lot of today, especially in these difficult times. I'm sure if you have kids, patience is probably running pretty low right now, being locked inside. Sometimes we need to be patient with the stores and what's happening with grocery stores and all the other places that have things that we feel like we need, but they might not have them in stock. All these things, the government, the way that they're handling things, we need to have patience sometimes with that as well. I think most of all, we need to have patience with God. We need to allow God to work, and we need to say, God, I'm going to trust you to work in this time, and I'm going to trust your timeline versus mine. And so this week, as we, again, spend more time at home, let's think about patience. How does our patience affect our faith, and how does our faith affect our patience? So I know it's difficult, but I think this week is a good week to think about patience. So again, next week it looks like we will be online once more. Again, this is probably going to be for the next few weeks that we will do this, but I hope that you guys are doing okay. Hope everybody is safe and healthy. If you need anything, please let me know. I'm going to say a prayer to wrap us up this morning. Lord, again, I just thank you for all the things you do for us. You provide so well for us, and you take care of us so well. Lord, I just pray that we are patient in waiting for you and in the way that you work. And I just pray that we know and realize and really know that you are in control, and that you know what's best for all of us, and you know what's best when it comes to timing as well. Lord, help us to work on our patience during this time. Lord, I pray that you be with all the people who are affected by this virus, all those who are ill, and all those that are working so hard, all the doctors, nurses, everybody that's working hard to work with these patients. I just pray that you put your hand over all of them and their families as well. Lord, I pray that we don't live a life of fear, because we have you, we have our hope in you. Lord, again, just be with all those who are affected by this. And Lord, I ask that this be over quickly, if it is your will. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. So again, thank you all. I will hope to see you again soon. I'm praying for you all. Hopefully you are praying for me as well. And until we see each other again, I'll be praying for you. Goodbye.